Hello, friends, and welcome back to The Drop and the Ripple with Julia Dunn and myself, Nell Hood. In our first episode, we talked to Ronnie Camphausen, a longtime resident of Phippsburg, Maine. Hers is an iconic story of the love for and dependency on nature present in coastal Mainers. In talking to her, we could understand the vulnerability of this community in the face of an unpredictable climate future. As we heard in Ronnie's description of changes in species and habitat on the coast, it's clear that Maine has already withstood radical change in the past decade. By some estimates, the Gulf of Maine is warming 99% faster than the rest of the world's oceans. Since 2004, the temperature has been rising about 0.41 degrees Fahrenheit per year. This warming has already caused a shift in where some marine life is found in the ocean, and this has been paired with a slow influx of new species and a rapid loss of others. This trend is predicted to accelerate, if anything, in the coming years. Many lobstermen echo Ronnie's unease in the face of looming changes predicted to happen in the Gulf of Maine. Coming to Shortridge this week, I wanted to ask local people like these about the ways in which their work is more place-based than most Americans. I was looking to have in-depth interviews which would result in statistics and easily traceable scientific narratives regarding the ways in which climate change has negatively impacted industries like lobster fishing. What I got instead were personal stories about dependence on nature and constant resilience in the face of changing jobscapes. I was struck by the observational and adaptive skills of everyone I interviewed along the Maine coast. I learned that I couldn't reduce the narrative of these people to data points. Rather, the ways that these fishermen interact with their natural surroundings are so much more emotional, generational, and intricate than any scientific statistics could reveal. In thinking about the title of our podcast, The Drop and the Ripple, I noticed a gap in my own knowledge. Originally, I wondered why there often is no marked ripple effect or social change that results from the drops of scientific knowledge injected into our collective consciousness. Now I see that without the development of empathy through the drops of personal narrative that are so often overlooked, there can be no ripple at all and thus no change. I was lucky enough to interview Samuel Belknap III, a former lobsterman and current anthropologist working at the University of Maine Orono. He is currently a PhD student in the Adaptation to Abrupt Climate Change program. He is pursuing a degree in anthropology and environmental policy, and his work focuses on bridging the gap between the scientific drop and the emotional ripple through productive conversations about the uncertain future that fishermen, especially in Maine, are facing. We welcome him now to the show.
Everything you need is right in front of you, when you learn to see. Good things come to you. All you have to do is stop and take a look around.
How are you on this fine spring day?
I am great. It is so warm out. It's so nice. It's like,
About time, right?
I know, it's absolutely about time. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. Sorry, it's
No,
a
absolutely.
little weird with the planning and the the calling. It's a lot.
It all worked out in the end.
I know.
That's all that
I
matters.
know. What else in your life brought you to this work, and what is kind of like your previous relationship and history with the coast of Maine or lobstermen?
I grew up as a Maine lobsterman. I learned how to fish from my grandfather.
Oh wow.
My family still owns a lobster wharf down in Bristol in Round Pond Village.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad's I say a part-time fisherman. He fishes 400 traps, which is half of the limit as a secondary job.
Mm-hmm.
So we're a non-traditional fishing family, but we're a fishing family nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always been interested in climate change work. I got my BA in anthropology and was more interested in kind of how humans have dealt with environmental change in the past, and spent a lot of time looking at the archaeological record. And I was actually headed off to a PhD program in Missouri, an archaeological program at the University of Washington in Missouri, when I was running my family's lobster dock in 2012. And I don't know how aware you are of kind of what happened in 2012, but
Yeah.
we had an anomalously warm winter and early spring in the Gulf of Maine, and that led to kind of increased lobster catches and increased lobster abundance well before the start of the tourist season. And because Canada also had a kind of a booming spring, the lobster processing capacity kind of was filled well before there was a significant demand for lobsters because of the warm water. And as a result, kind of the price of lobsters fell through the floor and really devastated kind of the lobster fishery. It took almost a year for prices to rebound.
Oh, wow.
And thanks to some good marketing initiatives, now the price is back up again. But it really drove home the impact that climate change, and particularly abrupt climate change, could have on kind of the one fishery that's remaining as a viable source of income in the state of Maine. And as I said, I was running my family's dock, so I get to see this firsthand and kind of see both the environmental impacts and kind of the social and cultural impacts as they were occurring that summer. And that really led me to look more at pursuing sort of contemporary climate change issues. And thankfully, the University of Maine that year just started their anthropology and environmental policy program, as well as received National Science Foundation funding for what they call their integrative graduate education and research traineeship, or the IGERT program, and that was focusing specifically on adaptation to abrupt climate change. So I kind of saw those two avenues as my option for staying in the state of Maine and helping to give back to the industry that helped to raise me. So that's kind of how I got to where I am now. Since being here and realizing how many different topics intersect both the fisheries world and the climate change world, it's kind of led me to look specifically at the lobster fishery and adaptation there.
It's really cool that there's this like new platform for change, and for that, like, even in the face of this kind of like oncoming disaster, there are already people looking for like adaptations and ways to like kind of be resilient. And I think, is that kind of what you're focusing on in your research? Or
my research is specifically focusing on leadership in the Maine lobster fishery and how leadership plays a key role in climate change adaptation. But what my master's is, I'm trained as a climate scientist, but what I'm really interested in kind of the human behavior, the human cultural side of things, and what role in particular leaders play in helping fisheries deal with these changes through kind of the regulatory process. What conversations are they having with lawmakers and legislators and nonprofits to try to come up with ways to address both the kind of longer term trend in climate change and also the potential threat of these rapid, abrupt events.
Who do you see as the like main leaders for this issue, or is it a very diverse group and kind of like depends?
It's a diverse group, but there are, there are probably a group of 6 or 7 influential lobstermen that are kind of leading these discussions, that have been heavily involved with climate change discussions and topics like that. And one is the current president of the Maine Lobstermen's Association, Dave Cousins. Another is Bob Baines from Spruce Head. I don't know if he's still serving on the Maine Lobster Advisory Council, but he has served as the chair of that for a while. And they're incredibly active, and members of the Maine Lobstermen's Association are incredibly active in these both conversations at the state level when it comes to things like licensing and other topics that are being talked about now, but also in conversations with scientists from both the state's universities and colleges as well. The scientific community has come a really long way with when it comes to listening to the fishery. There's an entire generation of fishermen that remember that the discussions around V-notching of egg-bearing lobsters was something that the industry had to fight for, and something that scientists did not advocate for. But it's something that turns out to be one of the most successful conservation practices the fishery has ever developed. And there's still that reticence of a lot of fishermen to buy into scientific findings about the fishery because of that legacy. They knew that something was successful and was worth putting into law, and they were fought in that regard from the scientists. So it's been hard to move forward, but I think a lot of researchers and a lot of people at the state level have come a long way in understanding that you start by listening to the fishermen rather than bringing your presuppositions to the table.
Yeah, it's like we've had a couple conversations with some lobstermen so far, and it's just like unbelievably humbling and just like kind of awe-inspiring how much they know just from working the same place all their lives, and like I don't know, it's a huge breadth of knowledge. It just coming from like the work that they're doing, and so that was really something that has really struck me so far, is just like how much you can get to, how much you know from working a place your whole life or doing a certain like place-based work your whole life.
Yeah,
it's really unbelievable.
Oh, absolutely, it is. There's this bizarre separation between kind of scientific knowledge and local ecological knowledge or traditional knowledge, and there's really absolutely no difference between the scientific method and the way that fishermen gather information through the course of their life and their experience working on the water. So arbitrarily separating those is a disservice to moving conversations forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's that. So as leaders and like as you and your colleagues and the research that you're doing, what are some of the ways and like what are some of the most important actions that either have begun materializing in these coastal communities, or are you're hoping to like put in place that this fishery can use to like combat this ever-present looming climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is, again, and harkening back to in organizations like the nonprofits and organizations like Maine Sea Grant, establishing opportunities for scientists and fishermen to have conversations around these things, to make sure that their voices are given equal weight when it comes to the lawmaking process, because the state legislators and the federal government can implement policies to their heart's content, but if they're not taking into account kind of the specific place-based nature of a lot of these impacts and the uniqueness of both the fishery and the climate change circumstances in the Gulf of Maine, then those laws and regulations most likely won't be successful. And kind of one of the things that I hope, first of all, one of the things that manifests that and kind of builds off of these conversations is a project I've been working on out of South Thomaston with Esperanza Stancioff from Maine Sea Grant and Cooperative Extension, where in response to 2012, the community of South Thomaston and Spruce Head were asked, what are your concerns about climate change? They were able to build a kind of a visualization, what's called a VCAPS diagram, which stands for Vulnerability, Climate Adaptation, and Planning Scenarios. And it's all built around a conversation about where a community views itself as vulnerable to climate change, as well as what opportunities does that community have to deal with those changes. Yeah. And from these conversations, we've developed a model, a financial model, that takes into account economic and ecological circumstances that can help fishermen kind of do some scenario planning and understand how changing their fishing behavior under certain environmental circumstances can impact their bottom line or how much money they make at the end of the year. And I love the quote that Dave Cousins, the president of the MLA, said as part of this project, that fishermen need to fish smarter and not harder. And to do that, it's necessary to have these broad-ranging conversations about climate change and climate change impacts and climate change adaptation, because there's no one that has a better idea of what these climate change impacts are and may potentially be than those individuals that are working on the water every day, and that's the fishermen themselves.
Absolutely. Where do you see these, or where have these conversations been happening, and where do you see them happening more in the future?
I know a lot of these have been built around some of the nonprofit organizations. The Island Institute for 10 years has been hosting their Climate Roundtable event, where they bring together fishermen and scientists and policymakers to discuss the previous year, climate change in the Gulf of Maine, its impact on different fisheries, what fishermen are seeing. And also, again, the state's colleges and universities are having conferences or organizing conferences in conjunction with some of these nonprofit organizations to provide venues for communities to come and talk about climate change. And I'm hoping in the future that these nonprofits can serve as a kind of a vehicle to help communities themselves have these conversations at the local level, because as I mentioned earlier, these are kind of very place-based, community-based impacts, and the responses are going to need to be place-based and community-based. So the closer to the grassroots that these conversations can be had, the better off and more successful and more applicable they're going to be. I'm here to learn from them and to help them meet the goals that they set for themselves and their fishery, and facilitate that with scientific information and support. So it's one of those things. It's so much well-intentioned research puts forth ideas that may not be desirable from the fishery or from the level of the individual fisherman. So the more that conversations around climate change can happen at the community level and incorporate the voices of the fishermen themselves, the more applicable and the more successful adaptation conversations and adaptation actions will be. All I can do is help to learn from the fishermen and to provide tools in conjunction with those fishermen who are willing to adapt, that can help them adapt. So it's I took a short course a few years ago with Matt Nisbet from Now Northeastern, who's a climate change communication specialist. And there's a certain segment of the population that they say it's not worth having these, trying to convince, because there's no convincing them. And you're better served at reinforcing the behaviors and the thoughts of those people who are supporters and are willing to help move change forward, and those people who may be on the fence. And for those people, the conversation sometimes comes easier when presented with kind of the real world scientific impact of climate change. The people that require a lot of convincing may not, in the long run, ever change their minds, and so those targeted communications may be better served at, again, preaching to the choir to help mobilize action, rather than getting everyone on board.
Yeah. A lot of conversations we've had are actually very similar along that strain of there's really all you can do at this point is try and change yourself and try and learn as much as you can and help as much as you can, but really it's in your individual hands, and it's it's simultaneously empowering but kind of daunting, being like, oh, I can only change myself, but like in changing myself, hopefully we're working on a bigger future. But, on reflection, it became clear from my exchange with Sam that while each person may just be a drop, the ripple comes from conversation, productive conversation where people are listening to each other's experiences and working to learn from these stories. This was echoed in another interview I was able to have with Lawrence Pye, a lobsterman in Phippsburg who, at the young age of 33, needs to be thinking about the longevity and future of the fishery he is dependent on. We welcome him now, along with Henry Colt and Kawhi Marin, who are going to be co-interviewers at this time.
And have you seen any changes in fishing since you've been here?
I'd say like the resources shifted a little bit, like offshore for sure. Like the offshore fishery, and as lobsters, the population has grown. Like the offshore fishery has exploded. So and that like it goes back to like you really can't survive like inshore. Like when I started, water temperature. I mean, water temperature is probably the biggest concern. I'll say and disease. So and they probably go hand in hand. So in 2012 we saw a rapid increase in shell disease. And you see it more on the older lobsters that don't molt as often. And I'd say that to like those 2 solid winters, the cold winters, like you saw it go away. I mean, that would be a concern this year. Yeah. So, lobstering, the Gulf of Maine's really become like a monoculture in like a lot of ways. So, I mean, it wouldn't take very long if the right disease to like rip through a population like that.
So if the population does get ripped through, what would you do? Do you think you'd move, switch up your practice, try to find a different type of job, or what do you think?
I mean, I think eventually you'd probably have to I think you'd have to move on eventually. I think like it reaches a certain point, like economically, like there's a break-even point, and like if you can't reach that, like I think you're kind of done. And I think on the western part of the state, we are a little bit more vulnerable to that than the guys down east. So I mean, that's not to say that like some people wouldn't hang on and be okay. But in terms of like being there and thriving, like I think most people would prefer that over simply just suffering by.
I was talking to this guy yesterday, Samuel Belknap. He works at Orono, and he's like big into the conversations between fishermen and scientists about like where the future of the lobstering industry is going. And he's like, the biggest thing that we're finding is that like we need to help like fish smarter, not harder. And I was just wondering what you thought of that statement, or if you're kind of trying to incorporate that as like a younger fisherman like working towards the longevity of
you try. I think that goes back to like cooperative. Like if you're truly going to do that, like it can't just be one fisherman. Like someone can maybe start the trend or something like that, but like you really need a group and you need a lot of buy-in to get it to go. It's simple things like cooperative, like down east, like there's a bunch of different places where they have cooperatives. Like you're essentially becoming your dealer, and like they should have done it years ago around here. They didn't, but like that would be like improving like the economic situation. Things like diversification, like anything like that, like would help like long term. In terms of like because if lobstering is not as strong, like can you have access to other fisheries to maintain your facilities, infrastructure, and all that stuff. I think I got a little away on you, but
that's totally.
But yeah, I mean, it also like for the smarter and harder, like trap limits. Like a lot of people are deathly. We fish 600. Like I don't know if Brett told you guys, like in our zone in E, but all the other zones except for some of the island exclusive zones are 800. But if you ask some people, it's it's a mixed bag. That depends on who you ask. But some people are like dead set against ever giving up any traps. But at the same time, like what they found, and I was a kid. It was my dad. This is all like listening to the older guys. They were like panicked when they went from like the 1,200 limit to the 1,000 to 800 and then to 6. But everything was fine. They caught just as many lobsters. Like the other factor was like when more people came in, it kind of mitigated that. So like you had to have a control on the amount of effort, like if you're going to do that. But like we could fish less traps. The Canadians do it. They fish seasons. So that's a marketing issue in terms of lining up there. But the Canadians, depending on where they are, like 275, maybe 400, and they catch more lobsters than in the state of Maine. I think probably what you're saying is like, is it better to work together? Like, Yeah, it definitely would be like great, but like I think realistically, it's like, I mean, Jamie knows. He's heard me complain about it before. Like with the average age, like being like well over 60, the guys on Harvard, it's not gonna happen.
Yeah.
Like maybe with some of the younger guys, you know, like people come along, I think that would improve.
Right.
And it would be better. Like personally, I would like it more. If you get buy-in, like anything's easier. Like it comes back to the, like what you said about politics. Like, is it better to have like just like a someone managing the fishery with a heavy hand, and they're just like they dictate the rules? Like, you know, I would go the other way and say like it's better like if you had like the local councils and they worked really well, and you had a lot of buy-in, and people said, hey, like, you know, we should do this. Like, you know, despite our independent nature, like it's mutually beneficial to like take these like steps together. It's like the minimum and the maximum gains of notching, like you know, it's like all those practices, like you're doing it as an individual, but it's like for the collective good.
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, I would say like it would be better. Like how you go about that, like I think is like an age-old question. Yeah.
In my short time in Phippsburg, I found myself doing an incredible amount of listening. From listening to people in the community to listening to my comrades and fellow goons around the dinner table, I didn't do a lot of speaking. Instead, I was absorbing and learning by opening my ears and my mind to those around me. My grandmother often says, when you speak, you only repeat what you already know, but when you listen, you open yourself up to learning something new. In the face of a daunting future, what I see as one of the first steps in moving forward is the simple act of listening. Listening to the communities that are already being affected and implicated in this problem. Listening to the people who have so much knowledge about this place they are intimately connected to, because it is what sustains them.
Circle. We always need to start from within. If we try to start with the broader picture, it's useless. You know, we're not gonna be very successful because we don't know how to. We have to have respect within ourselves and respect within our own circle in order to make changes outside.
A big thanks to everyone who so graciously gave us their time and let us interview them. And our deepest thanks to Elizabeth Mueller and Bates College for affording us this wonderful opportunity.